Is metamodern spirituality in a privileged position to explore and integrate cultural metamodernism with philosophical and evolutionary sociopolitical metamodernism? Or does the philosophical definition of metamodern cultural theory already include all of that? Or exclude all of that? Are there a lot of things we're calling metamodern that we shouldn't be? Or are there a lot more things we should be including in an expanded and still evolving notion of metamodernity? Are we more likely to understand each other if we pretend our words have specific predefined meanings, or if we pretend words are just a shifting pluralistic screen that conceals the real insight structures we're pointing towards? I'm Layman Pascal. I was co-editor of the Metamodern anthology Dispatches from a Time Between Worlds and leader of the recent Metamodern Spirituality retreat in Vermont. And joining me to help find out if any of us know what the hell we're talking about is Greg Dember, a well-intentioned, self-aware fellow who sometimes ends up being the go-to guy in online discussions between freewheeling neo-metamodernists and the classic turn-of-the-millennium cultural theorists who were descriptively languaging the shift they saw away from aperspectival madness deconstruction and the flatland relativism of postmodernism as the dominant avant-garde mode to some new mood in which the self-aware risk of being serious again on the other side of multi-contextuality starts to rise up from many directions. I think Greg and I stand together in front of questions such as, is there history beyond the end of history, art beyond the end of art, a viable subjectivity that transcends or deviates from the death of the subject? But we come into this space from different sources, in different moods, and with different normative presuppositions. And for me, that's exactly the kind of sameness enough to be different that makes a conversation interesting. So I'm very pleased to welcome Greg Dember to the integral stage for a topic so good, someone should be paying us to do this. Hi, Greg.
You're not paying me? No, hey, yeah, that was a really scintillating introduction, seriously.
Was it as good as the hat?
Better.
Nice. Where do you come into this from? How did you get involved in the concept of metamodernism? What attracted you to it, and what do you feel like it's pointing towards?
Yeah, I was personally attracted to and interested in and curious about the thing that metamodernism is, the stuff, the territory, if you want to use the map and territory. I was interested in that stuff before I knew a word for it. And before there was a word for it, before metamodernism was applied to it. I'm a person, because of the age that I am, I kind of came of age, my teens and my early 20s, during kind of like the height of the postmodern period. And while I enjoyed and laughed at and was intellectually stimulated by a lot of the postmodern culture, I always kind of had a yearning for there to be more of a place for sincerity and heartfelt appreciation of truth and beauty and all that stuff. And then I kind of learned about postmodern on a theory level in college, and where I went to Yale, and Yale in the 80s was kind of like a hotbed of postmodern theory in literature and also, in other departments, philosophy, etc. And so, of course, you wonder if the thing is called postmodernism, and that means after modernism, then is there going to be a post-postmodernism, and what will that be like? And, I was asking all of those questions in my head with my friends, just as, kind of casual thinkers in the 80s and the 90s. And we did kind of imagine this, though the first musician that seemed that way was this guy, Jonathan Richman. And I don't know if you know that his music, but he's like a cult following guy, although he had songs in the movie Something About Mary, and you might have seen that. So what he was like, and this is kind of before metamodernism really took off in general, he was a progenitor of it. He would play these songs that were so disarmingly naive seeming that you would first assume he's mocking that kind of naivete, that he's doing some sort of a play, a joke, snarky, whatever, but he stays with it to the point where you're like, oh, I'm actually kind of enjoying this in a very innocent way, and maybe he is too, maybe he's not mocking it at all, then he takes it even further, and then he's like, he must be mocking it because no adult would be singing about these things. And then just on and on with that kind of switch of, is this a postmodern mocking thing, or is this a just straightforward modernist sincere reckoning with human nature kind of thing? And that was kind of his shtick. And he, was a good melodicist and a good songwriter. Anyway, so in my little group of friends, we just used the word postmodern to talk about that kind of thing. And then as the 2000s unrolled, I started noticing more of this kind of thing happening in a bigger level in indie rock and in indie film, and on some television shows that were coming out, and in fiction, in literary fiction, to where it was definitely a thing. And my thinking partner, Linda Ceriello, who I write with now, we would again sort of just casually notice all this stuff. And then she then entered a graduate program in religious studies and kind of wanted to start monitoring this trend in religion itself. So had to get kind of more serious about it. And she discovered the metamodernism concept as put forth by Timotheus Vermeulen and Robin van den Akker in a 2010 article called Notes on Metamodernism. And again, I wasn't thinking of myself as any sort of qualified academic person, but I just decided that Linda and I didn't decide for her, but I persuaded Linda to start a blog with me. But basically, we just started on Tumblr of just cataloging examples of this metamodern sensibility. And then through Linda's actual bona fide academic standing, I kind of wormed my way in, or got brought into some sort of more legitimate discussions. And I've spoken at actual academic conferences and been published as a co-author with Linda in books and academic books and things like that. Meanwhile, then, because of the internet, I've been exposed to kind of like your world and its usage of metamodernism. And for whatever reason, I end up being the one in these conversations a lot. So I've then sort of done a little bit of a study of what you guys call the liminal web and such. And I had read a lot of Ken Wilber way back, like in the 90s and the early 2000s. So I already have kind of my own familiarity, but not in any in-depth way, especially socially. So I hope that covers it.
That's fantastic. So I come into this from that side, from the integral and spiral dynamics community originally, where I had a similar thing in terms of map and territory. I used to think about integral lists versus integral lights. So you could be an integral list, you could know the map really well and not be the thing the map is describing, or you could be presencing in yourself the kind of world space and insight set that the map points to, but have no idea and no interest in the map. Mm-hmm. So there was this living territory. And it also seemed to me that what was being described was something that maybe we'd call liminal now, that it rested on, if you're going to integrate multiple perspectives, then you're performing an operation in the space that people normally point to between perspectives. And you go, well, there's so many perspectives, or I changed my mind, or everybody's positions need to be taken. All that kind of thinking presumes that you can move between perspectives or take multiples into account. So I kept looking at that junction. That was really clear in my mind. And then I got into, through people like Daniel Gortz and that kind of Hanzi metamodernism, I got involved with Perspectiva, Jonathan Rowson and I, and Lenny Rachel Anderson's book on metamodernity was influential for me. But we tried to put together half a dozen to a dozen different definitions of what metamodernity was pointing to try to sum it up and see where it's going now. And also Brent Cooper was there to keep pointing to, possible different metamodernities in various counter-hegemonic discourses from the last 150 years. So my sense of it coming in is of a very rich, very open space with a number of different sources that have something in common, that it's still trying to be languaged. And that liminal points to that. I know that in like Vermeulen in his work seems to point to a shift in the way we use the in-betweenness, that postmodernism was using in-betweenness in a certain way, and that metamodernism is taking that in a different direction, but playing off that same capacity to see the importance of that. So that's where I come into it from. And it's admittedly, and by my own temperament, very open, very flexible, I tend to welcome in more and then maybe edit it later rather than go, oh, that's not really correct. But I'm very interested in where we're coming in from lines up or doesn't line up. And I think there's a lot of people in these conversation spaces that are also probably unfamiliar with the sources of metamodernism that you look at, but curious, wanting to know, partly as an attempt to refine what's going on for them, wanting to know, where are the edges and how do we find the edges of this thing? So when you think of metamodernism, what would you say are its main characteristics?
It's a sensibility. It's a way of reacting to and understanding and aesthetically shaping the world and the parts of the world that we encounter. And it engages the clever part of our mind and the reflectively aware part of our mind, the part of our mind that's constantly telling a story about the story. But it also engages the heart and sort of the sense of true selfhood and kind of like optimistic, sort of inspired emotions, or true, authentic mourning, or even loathing, or things like that. And I always fear when I talk about this, like, should I explain it abstractly, like I kind of am doing now, or should I give examples? And I guess I'll stay with the abstract.
Yeah, we'll come back to examples.
Okay. So kind of like my little rubric is metamodernism or metamodern cultural products protect the sense of interiority against the potential degradations of postmodern relativism, modernist reductionism, and traditional or pre-modern ontological inertia. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's a cool way to put it.
But primarily we're talking about songs and TV shows and movies, or also like cultural subcultures that share a slang or share a language or things like that. But we're not as much talking about like sort of abstract intellectual projects, although we could be, but yeah, it's grounded in these, what I call cultural products.
Yeah, I think from the part of the community that I'm coming from, there needs to be a lot more attention paid to the cultural products, which I think people are doing casually, in their relationships in little groups personally, but I don't think it's as present as it needs to be in the conversation that's calling itself metamodern politics or metamodern spirituality, those sorts of conversations. And it's interesting the way you describe it. I wonder a little bit whether it's, are we talking about just postmodernism where the heart has caught up to the mind? When I think about modernism, I often think that most modern people aren't modern yet, right? You tell them in school that the world is round, but they haven't really figured it out. It's just a received belief from an authority. So they might as well become flat earthers. They're just pre-modern people in a modern package. And I think a similar thing with postmodernism, where intellectually people get it, but their hearts haven't caught up to what they've been taught. And very often that's because they're getting certain cultural messages from day one, but B, in school and in secondary school and university and things like that. And they're not having the emotional experiences and lived reality to catch up to that so that they can bring their heart along on that journey. So that's one thing I wonder. But when I think of metamodernism, I'm thinking of, obviously, like you said, something that's postmodern, right? Something that is capable of the moods and structural insights of postmodernity, but not limited to it. And that has an intellectual and a social and an attitudinal element to it. I think of a space in which the different cultural codes or levels or V-beams or whatever we want to call them, these epistemic changes in history can be put together on the same page and include the postmodern and be looked at all together. So sometimes I think of metamodern as the background space that allows us to think postmodern along with all the other different phases of sociology through history.
Somewhere in here, we should both do our definitions of postmodern.
Yes, we absolutely should.
Yeah.
I would say that it's a community of people who are more aware of different parts of themselves and interested in achieving some kind of more optimal balance or coherence or good conscience blending between the different aspects of ourselves and the different aspects of the world whose fissures are opened up by that kind of postmodern insight. And I think also that more and more it's what kind of people can we be authentically in the era of multiple perspectives and the metacrisis, or convergent world systems crises are happening, and that's a serious thing, and we have to really inhabit this world now, this network world, this global destabilization world. It's something more serious is required, where we have to show up as real people, as the way we imagine our ancestors were real inhabitants of the world and not distanced observers, critiquers of the world. So those are the main things I think of. And like I said before, a lot of the, I think of it as how you become an inhabitant of the interstitial, rather than just someone observing and reacting to the interstitial. How do you really live from that? And maybe that's performativity, or maybe that's a new kind of irony, or there's a number of different ways to approach that. But the thing that postmodernism points to is something we have to make a life in, not just recoil from or have it be an amusing way of critiquing ourselves. But your question is great. How do you think of postmodernism? Because that's central to this discussion.
Sure. I think that postmodernism was and is a response to modernism. Modernism being a self-conscious emphasis on innovation, on the power of human intellect, on a belief in the possibility of objectivity and ethical valuing of objectivity, and therefore an implied universalism, because if you can see some sort of objective truth, that must be true for everybody and applicable and useful to everybody. And you can sort of use the term modernity. Sorry, here I am talking about modernism when we're supposed to talk about postmodernism, but you can use, I would use the term modernity to describe kind of the world, the structure of society that we're in. And I think that modernity began a little while before modernism began. Modernity began with the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the nation states and all that. And modernism is kind of more of a self-conscious movement in the arts and in the kind of discourses that were happening for people as they made sense of the world, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Like an awareness that, this kind of new way of being has been happening for a while, but now we're embracing it and we're commenting on it and doing things with it in front of us instead of just it kind of being a stream that we're carried along. And I think that began a little bit before the turn of into the 20th century. That began in the late 1800s. And then postmodernism, which began in the 50s, post World War II, post the dropping of the atomic bombs, such like that, saw the limitations of the modernist approach and a kind of fatigue with the modernist approach, or even a somewhat of a recoiling. And it recognized the hubris of the modern project. And so it focused on context, and it focused on, previously unpaid attention to viewpoints. It questioned the solidity of boundaries and borders and categories of things that had been taken for granted. It was more interested in the relationships between things than in the things themselves. And it even questioned, sort of like basic categories of existence like the self. And it was interested in systems and how, the whole, and how the whole is composed of parts, and the parts are only meaningful in terms of the whole, and all of that kind of stuff. And so in the arts, a lot of that kind of came through with an emphasis on irony and intertextuality, meaning texts or art projects that made reference to other texts, and often with the intent of reminding the viewer of an art project that it is an art project, that it's not some freestanding reality, and that everything's constructed and everything has a point of view, and all of that kind of stuff. And that sounds kind of very heady, but when experienced, it can be very playful and fun and stimulating and liberating. It can be liberating from sort of like a fixed way of being. It can liberate you into like, oh, I can make choices about how I experience things, and I can sort of see like the underpinnings that are really just, like I can see the curtain that Oz is behind and know that it's a projection, and it can be fun. And then I won't go into metamodernism, but metamodernism then came along when that kind of sense had played itself out, and people found it lacking in certain ways, which we can get to later. So that's what postmodernism is.
Yeah, great. Postmodernism. I mean, a lot of my thinking is in the technologically driven sense, where that I think there have been many times in history where something like modernity tried to get started, where people who were literate or who thought in a literate way, even if they were in an oral culture, started to come together and let's focus on math and astronomy, and the ancient Greeks had a steam engine. Yeah. So they're trying, but it doesn't really lock in until you've got the printing press and, I would argue, glass lenses, right? Where you get telescopes and microscopes and windows all of a sudden. And then this thing takes off and it starts to run a new program, and that program builds up into a new kind of culture, which starts to become modernist in the sense of recognizing what it's doing. And then similarly, I think postmodernism is in many respects a response to digital technology webs, so that we start to experience the world as people raised on the internet or raised on television. Television people are open to multiple channels, and so psychedelic drugs sound really good to them in the 1960s because it seems like switching channels. Mm-hmm. They're now seeing so much more of the world than they used to, right? They watch the Vietnam War rather than reading about World War II in the newspaper. Right. And when you see more of it, there's an opportunity to be more critical and also more personal because it's showing up in your home. You're like, oh my God, look, it's right on the screen there. So that critical spirit joins with the romantic critique of modernity that had been simmering all along. And so then you get these sort of like a digital network culture combined with retro romanticism. And as a network culture, it's really open to dynamic relationships. It's really open to switching. And so as it switches, you start to notice these in-betweens and these weird juxtapositions that you didn't notice before. And I think you're right. It can be a very playful thing, but it also is, it's easy for people to get trapped there, to just, be trapped in the state of mind-bogglingness between realities and go, oh, there's nothing can be counted on, man. It's all just relative. And also that switching allows you to go into context that might have been left out of the modern story. You're like, okay, that was great, but is GDP really the metric we should be looking at? Is there really only one universe in our physics, or do we have to take multiple universes into account? Are there other people who weren't mentioned in our Constitution, as good as it was? So this sense of needing to enfold back into the system the things that modernity didn't notice it was leaving out. I think that becomes a real ethical thing, but it's available to us because we're aware of jumping between contexts. So we've been able to do that and locate these other contexts and start to take them seriously, including ecology, which was like the main thing that was left out of the modern story, was the whole background web.
Right.
And I think of that as something that's going to be increasing over time. Like in 100 years of digital technology, we've barely seen the effects so far. It's going to be an ongoing transformation. And in some ways, I think of metamodernism as a next step, as a maturing of the thing that caused postmodernism, a way of starting to figure out how we live in this world rather than just react to it, how we go beyond critics of modernity to people who have to show up as multidimensional real creatures in this world that we're seeing that is so multi-contextual and networked and relational and faces these ecological things and can't be described the way modernity was describing it, but still needs to be lived in a way that moves us toward the good.
Yeah. Not too far off from.
Yeah, no, this is the same enough to be different.
Yeah. I thought I was making mental notes about things that I wanted to respond to, but they fell by the wayside. So I'll just respond to my latest thought if you were done.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think that in culture, so again, this distinction between modernity and modernism and postmodernity and postmodernism. So I use the term postmodernity to describe that structural world that has technology in it that creates the space where there's like this overwhelming input and multiple points of view to consider and instant feedback and all of these kinds of things. That's postmodernity. So and then postmodernism was art and cultural products. And when I say cultural products, I use that term because I want it to include both like obvious pieces of art and song and literature, but also ground level stuff like popular slang terms and prevalent senses of humor and ways people relate to their churches and their governments and things like that. So the postmodern cultural products often are simply bringing awareness to the nature of postmodernity. And sometimes they're celebrating it, and sometimes they're criticizing it, and sometimes they're criticizing the insufficiencies of the modernist viewpoint. And I think that when metamodernism began arising and when people were first making observations about metamodernism, at least for me, my assumption was that the metamodernism, the cultural products, were reacting to the insufficiencies of postmodern cultural products. So Seinfeld wasn't doing it for me anymore, even though it was hilarious. It sort of lacked a central emotional core. And I wanted television shows that were playful, like Seinfeld, but also had room for the emotional core, right? But now as the decades, now we've gone through like 2 decades of the 21st century, and you can't exactly say like metamodern cultural products are, fixing the inadequacies of postmodern cultural products because it's 20 years later. So now I think that metamodern cultural products both react to the postmodern sensibility, but also react to the ongoing structural postmodernity, which we could all even call hypermodernity. So in all the cases, though, the metamodern cultural products are defending a space for the subject and interiority and felt experience, whether it's against the crazy making of our complex, networked, interconnected mirror world, or if it's in response to the way postmodern cultural products celebrate and amplify that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's a very interesting idea, defending the space of the subject, in this situation where we're reacting to the ongoing hypermodernity.
Mm-hmm.
The 2 things that come up for me is that there's a couple different ways to think about that defense, right? You can think about it as, and this is rife in our communities, right? It's argued to death in the integral communities for years, is whether the postmodern is a return of like a pre-modern experience of subjectivity and interiority and intersubjectivity that's being protected, or whether it's a new version of doing that same thing that includes the postmodern vision, right? So,
and I would say number 2.
Right. Yeah, me myself as well. Like, I think if we examine ourselves now with both our psychological and philosophical and neurological tools, we see a community, a networked community, right? But that doesn't mean you don't get any of the things that pertain to selfhood. You get all of those things, and we should be able to do them even better if we have more accurate knowledge of what it consists of. And we can say, okay, all these things that people were doing in the past to deepen and develop as human subjects were heuristically valuable tactics that we can apply, understanding that we are plural network contextual entities, right? And so that's a big part of what Metamodern spirituality is for me. But the other thing is, when that space has been protected, what grows in that garden then? And I wonder, when we're talking about it, how much of it is we're looking at it from the lens of critiquing and protecting something from, versus what do we start to get in the space that we've been able to protect, and what is that going to grow into? And it will probably surprise us a little. But I'd love to hear some examples of what you think are metamodern and postmodern cultural products.
Okay. Well, that is an interesting approach to sort of compare. Like, Seinfeld was postmodern, and okay, I'll do that. I also, though, I want to talk about the film Everything Everywhere All at Once. I don't know if you've seen it yet.
So I loved it.
Okay, so let's get to that, and I will explain. I think it would be interesting to see our perspectives on why it is or is not metamodern.
Yeah.
But older cultural products. So Seinfeld is postmodern because it's a self-stated show about nothing. And I know that when I first heard that, I think I read about it in an article in Rolling Stone, and the headline was a show about nothing. Like that, I thought that was funny. That was like cute or clever. Oh, it's a show about nothing. Ha ha ha. And much of what goes, there's a human element to Seinfeld. You do have some kind of fondness for the characters, or people just wouldn't be able to watch it for long. But mostly it's what it brings to the audience is just this ongoing series of references to references to references to in-jokes that have been created on previous episodes of the show, and so it's just kind of this gym for the clever mind, that you get to just play in with these characters, and then contrast that with what I would call a metamodern show, also a comedy, like Community. Did you ever see Community? Yeah. And so Community, of course, is chock full of intertextuality and references to tropes from other television shows, and even has a character, Abed, who, like, that's all he does is make observations and he interprets his own experience as TV tropes. So it's got all of that postmodern stuff, but at the same time, it's much more than a show like Seinfeld delves into the actual interior, genuine psychology of the characters. And you will laugh when you're watching Community, but you might tear up at times in Community. You might think a character is an asshole at some time and laugh at the assholery of it, like Jeff Winger. And then other times you're moved by, his possibly just narcissistic speeches, but they're eloquent, and he does get to something about humanity in them. And there's a sense that the showrunners and the writers and even the actors who are playing the roles really do want to sort of like reach out and reach to the heart of the audience. So, that's a difference there. I could go into like different, music or whatever, or I could just jump to everything.
Yeah, let me just say one thing, which is an agreement about the Seinfeld thing, which is I think that the creators were very sincere and brought a lot of integrity to their own relationship to humor, right? They sort of famously defended it against the corporate structure and against what the network wanted to do. So and they chose actors who could create this really human relational thing. So it is there, but it's certainly not foregrounded. And it is true that they are very flat. They're just characters. And the show, the final episode, which a lot of people have complaints with, is sort of presents them as being trapped in an eternal prison of this ongoing self-referential dialogue, right? It's aware, the creators are aware that there's a real limitation to what you can do with that mode of structure. But let's go to Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Okay. I'm like right in the middle of writing about it, actually. So Everything Everywhere All at Once, to me, like, obviously, it's about the multiverse. And, we all speculate about, multiple realities and parallel universes and all that. It's not necessarily a real thing. But in this movie, it's a real thing. And yet, one could say that it's a metaphor for the multi-perspectival mind set. And, so to me, that's kind of initially seems postmodern. And spiritually, it's about sort of transcending the limited sense of self and expanding into like a bigger sense and an interconnection and all of that. And I consider that to be postmodern as well. But in the end, what Everything Everywhere All at Once does is the characters and the family. And that's the interesting thing too. It's dealing with all these cosmic, sort of very lofty, abstract issues, but it's also just about this little family of 4 people, if you include the grandfather, or 5 if you include the girlfriend of the daughter. It's about this family just trying to work its shit out. And so, that oscillation or juxtaposition between the very intimate and very real, very human, and then this like bizarro superhero movie, cosmic science fiction thing. Like, when do you see both of those really explored powerfully in the same movie? I don't think you do that often. And in the end, it's not simply about like tripping out about this expanded way of perceiving. It's doing the metamodern thing of saying, given this expanded consciousness, how do we retain a place for the individual interior and the intimate connection with other individual interiors? And that's what the characters end up settling into. And okay, now I'm going to kind of get on my, I'm going to be a little critical. So the reason why I've pushed back against a lot of the conceptualizations of metamodernism coming from what we can call the liminal world, and whether that means, Daniel Gertz and Emil Freis's Hanzi Freinachtian, or other people who have adopted the term metamodernism in similar but not exactly the same ways, I very much have seen in that liminal world metamodernism basically used to mean multi-perspectivalism. Metamodernism being mean to say like, hey, you can think something and you can think its opposite and all that. And that's not what we mean by metamodernism. We think of that multi-perspectivalism as postmodernism, and metamodernism is a response and says like, given that multi-perspectivalism is important, but it has its downside, which is that it often leaves no central standing ground to actually have conviction and believe in things. How do you live with the multi-perspectivalism and not be trapped in it? And so I suspect that people who think metamodernism is simply multi-perspectivalism and would view everything all at once and go, it's metamodern because it's about this expanded consciousness and the multiple universes and the multiple perspectives. And it's like, and my reaction is like, no, that's not why it's metamodern. It's metamodernism because it presents all of that. And then it presents the problems with that. And then it provides a solution to that doesn't deny the importance of the multi-reality thing.
Yeah, I mean, I temperamentally fairly generous in these spaces because I expect people to be coming in incomplete or interested in growing in their capacity to appreciate and understand and favor certain organizing perspectives. But I think that critique is correct structurally, right? It's integrative pluralism means you did something to the plurality. You integrated it somehow. You made a new workable human coherence, some kind of order that is empowering out of the multi-perspectival universe, right? And I mean, my metaphysics would argue that essentially what's being done there is that we're leveraging a metaphysics of intercontextuality, and you can run that right down the stack into the very nature of ontology and right up to human and social perception and spirituality, and you can start to redescribe everything humans have been doing as an interface, an intercontextual move. But also that's where the capacity and the harmony and the heart is generated. Just like it's not enough to understand that you're an internal plurality. That plurality has to work as a team, right? Your mind and your heart and your body and your conscious and your unconscious and your masculine and your feminine, they have to become better partners so that they really produce this effect that we would like to call the self in all of its depth and richness. And I think this movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once, does a fantastic job of that. I mean, it's been a long time since I came out of the movie theater feeling like I saw something novel that went all over, that had dozens of genres inside it, that took, and I appreciate what you were saying about the multiverse, because there's arguments that it's a physical reality from serious physicists, but it doesn't matter whether it is or not. It's an essential way of thinking about how we are and how the world is at this point. And the villain of the piece is demonstrating the nihilistic element that's within a simple flat acceptance of that multiplicity. Nothing has any meaning, right? The everything bagel
Mm-hmm.
is the flaw at the heart of postmodernism,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
It's a
the
beautiful
state,
metaphor because, you know,
yeah,
the shape of a bagel has the hole in the center.
yeah, it's an empty self-referential loop at the
Yeah.
heart of all the multi-perspectival experiences. And there's no way out of that except by returning to deep and sincere human affirmative connection and the full richness of what we are.
Mm-hmm.
But also, there's a switch in the meaning of the idea that nothing matters in the multiplicity, right? Like if nothing matters, then or
Mm-hmm.
well, because nothing matters, we're going to make connections with each other,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's like a mystic coming back going, now that I've seen that all things are transitory and illusory, I can dedicate myself to goodness.
Yeah. And in the
Versus the
movie,
mystic coming back and saying, I might as well just murder everyone because I've seen it's an
right.
illusion.
And actually in the movie, by the end, she's saying, nothing matters. We can do anything. And she's saying we can do anything with a smile, like we can do good stuff.
So the basic, the thing that's being seen in postmodernism is still there, but its significance has been flipped.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, was a tremendously useful presentation of what the postmodern and metamodernism shift is.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't say postmodernism was wrong about any of that stuff. It says the significance of what it was looking at was not being perceived properly. And when it is being perceived, then we have this return to the depth and the urgency of finding depth in ourselves and in the world and in each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just being honest, though, like I feel like the way, you know, you're talking about the relation between postmodernism and metamodernism doesn't sound all that different from what I believe, from how I use the term metamodernism. But I've seen in the liminal world, you know, and yeah, sure, I honor your point that like, well, people are entering the space and don't quite have all the concepts down, but I've seen from the very top, from the, you know, most like recognized and influential thinkers, unless they're all evolving in this right now as we speak, but sort of classically, like, you know, 2 or 3 years ago, which is like for this movement is classical 2 or 3 years ago, 5 years ago, if I read this stuff by the people who were calling themselves the Metamodernists, to me, that was just all postmodern stuff. And it was postmodern stuff, maybe specifically applied to this kind of new agey spiritual realm. But nevertheless, it was still, to me, postmodern. It was basically just about multi-perspectivality. And that's great if all of those folks are kind of coming around to looking at it the way you seem to look at it from what you're saying here. But those books are still out there. You know, those books and those articles are all out there being read by people and calling it metamodernism. So is there going to be some recanting or, you know, and that's kind of a provocative thing to say, and it's not on you to give an answer to that. So I'm just plopping that out like a little thing. And then metamodern spirituality. So if what you're doing, like in the metamodern spirituality workshop or whatever, or writings that you may do using that moniker, kind of goes along with sort of the perspective that you're talking about here, like, yeah, that sounds like an instance of a metamodern cultural product to me, but I wouldn't call it metamodern spirituality. I would call it metamodern new age spirituality. And I don't mean new age in a derogatory term, but like if someone were to just come into the space from the outside, what they're mainly going to notice is tropes that are common to the, you know, neo hippie new age movement. And that's not metamodern per se. You can have a metamodern version of it, which perhaps you do, but you can also have a metamodern Christianity and a metamodern Judaism and a metamodern Buddhism and a metamodern spiritual but not religious. And the flavor of all of those metamodern spiritualities are really different from what I've seen of the milieu that you're calling metamodern spirituality. And that's my critique.
Yeah. I don't know how much I agree or disagree with that. The term metamodern spirituality, I use it because of Brendan's group that he set up.
Yeah.
Because I like and work with Brendan. I could call it anything else. Bruce Holder and I have worked on integral post-metaphysical spirituality for many years now. It's classic. It's a couple of years old.
Yeah.
I think, and this is one of the things we've worked on in sort of integral spirituality and religion, is what we think of as a left and a right hand approach, which is to say, what is integral religion? Well, on the one hand, it's integral approaches in the form of any religion. On the other hand, it's some new kind of religiosity that's inventing itself from the ground up, involving people who are affiliated with integral and integral ideas and what they propose. So similar thing with metamodern, because they're both post-postmodern, arguably. So what is post-postmodern spirituality? Well, it's any spirituality taken in a post-postmodern fashion, but it's also something of its own that it's trying to work out. And it hasn't been worked out yet. I have some proposals for it. The very fact that I have proposals for it means that I'm not satisfied with the conversation, the community, things like that. I think there's a lot more rigor and specificity we need to bring to what it is. Although I'm comfortable with people being inchoate and partly aware and not knowing where it's going. The ferment of the community is great, I think, but it's the reason I have a position in that, like a position in sense of something that I propose, is because mostly I see something being implied in all of that, but not really being embodied or articulated. I think we're in the midst of beginning to work it out, because I see this as a young process still.
But why, I don't know if this is a great metaphor, but so people have written about metamodern film, literature, music, whatever. And if one filmmaker were to come along and say, my work, I'm starting a school of filmmaking called Metamodern Film, and that filmmaker was somebody that just did horror, like classically they did horror films, and now they're doing a metamodern version of horror films, which actually is a thing. There are horror films that are metamodern, and everything that they called a metamodern film was actually a metamodern horror film. To the general public who are encountering the term, metamodern film is going to seem like a kind of horror film, when metamodern film can be so many other kinds of film. And that's kind of my objection to how I'm seeing metamodern spirituality be used.
I would be perfectly happy to and do switch the terms constantly, because I'm pointing at something that's more general, I think. But there's also an inside out distinction in a way that's interesting when I look at the community. The main thing in a way about the metamodern spirituality thing that we had was a certain specific quality or flavor of the engagement, right? I'm there when people can lead sessions or describe what their theory is, but the main takeaway is what the quality of those people being together was. And that's a really inside perspective. Well, we kind of know what we mean. We're sort of working on this flavor of being us, and we actually don't care how it's perceived from the outside at all, because
Sure.
we're interested in
The thing.
gauging or exploring or trying to find the pathways that might be hidden in this space, versus having a look, go, well, how does this relate to the rest of the culture? Which
Right.
is another interesting perspective. But I think that you get a slightly different sense of what's important depending on which of
Right.
those angles you take.
So I'm a representative of the rest of the culture.
Yeah.
And then the question is, as part of the rest of the culture, Greg, why put so much focus? Why do you even care what this one group in our pluralistic world is doing? And there's the validity to that question. But if I do get brought in and asked by people who are from that world, which I do from time to time,
Yeah.
I have to just be real and say, well, I think you guys are in sort of a little bubble, and you've got to definitely have a thing going, and it's cool, it's got a lot of vitality to it. And this is America. We have free speech, and you guys can use language however you want. I'm not the dictator of that. But if I'm in a conversation with you and metamodernism means one thing to you and metamodernism means something else to me, and like one of my main preoccupations in life and in the work I'm doing now is about metamodernism, and I'm connected to all these other people that are using it in this way, then I'm going to react.
Yeah.
And try to find a way, if I'm going to be in the conversations, that I can, without the term being sort of co-opted and its other meanings being erased. And, so that's all out of sort of my intellectual self-interest. But what I would also put forth to your community is that if the metamodernism that I and others like me are identifying is a real thing, if it is a real trend and pattern in the world, and you're using the word to mean something else, you've now lost a word and a way of talking about a thing that should be playing into your total model of reality. And so like if integral already does a pretty good job of describing the thing that you're mainly preoccupied with, maybe you want to leave metamodern to mean something else, so that you can have those two concepts play with each other instead of one being sort of erased or subjugated.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And there's two different ways to hold terminology, and one is a little more fluid and one is a little more precise. And I think they're both useful. And I think that the idea of being like, hey, there's a number of kindred communities here. They're all part of something, right? And whether it's integral or game B or transdisciplinary thought, there's a lot of different ways that people are trying to leverage a new sincerity and coherence from out of multi-perspectival reality. And I think we see that all over. And I think all of those different groups, which overlap in a lot of people are in several of those zones.
Of course, yeah.
Right. So there's something going on there collectively, right? Liminal web was an attempt to languish what that is. I often have to list a dozen names, right? And the other thing about that community is there are people who've, I think more so than the average person, they're very aware of the limitations of labels. They're pretty sure, we'll probably call it something different in a couple of years. Because nobody's here because they want to be pinned down. They're here because they're looking for an enriched experience that reaches beyond those things. But in order to work out what it is that these things have in common, what makes them kindred, it may be important to maintain clarity of distinctions a little more than we've been doing. Right. And there are certainly people in the community who push for that and other people who push against it. But we'll see how it ends up. But I think it's a very good point to say that if we're looking at something that makes these things analogous to each other in different flavors, we need to be able to separate them out first so that we can see what that analogy is. What do they share is only available to us if we know where we want to provisionally make these distinctions.
Right.
Are we agreeing too much?
Maybe.
The poor viewer probably thought they were going to get a debate.
Yeah. Okay, so now this is opening up a whole other positive can of worms, not a bad can of worms, but maybe just something we don't have time to go into today. But I think what's interesting about the conversation and about sort of like the way you're articulating the problem, the issue, the whatever, is there's also this kind of metamodernism of Jason Josephson Storm, who has published a book called Metamodernism. And Metamodernism, what's the subtitle? Metamodernism, The Future of Theory. That's what his book is called. And what you were just saying about, oh shoot, I wish I could remember your words, but what you were just saying before we stopped as a sort of intellectual approach to dealing with categories and their overlap and their distinction from other categories, and not being too attached to labels, but understanding the importance of labels as tools for all of that. That's part of what Jason is talking about in his book, which he's trying to propose a way forward in scholarship, in academia, in the humanities. He's trying to propose a way to get out of the traps of postmodern obsession with not being caught seeming like you're naively. The postmodern obsession in academia, I think, is at all odds to not get caught sounding like you think you have an objective grasp on reality. And he's proposing intellectual tools to escape that. And we don't have time here to go probably deeper into that, but I feel like a lot of the way you have been speaking in this discussion may be examples of his proposals. And I have some discomfort with him sort of presenting his project as metamodernism per se, but I very much think that his project is an example of the metamodern approach to the issues that he's concerned with. And so it's just kind of cool to like sort of see you exemplify that.
Yeah, it does make it seem like there is something going on. Mm-hmm. And maybe I'll take a deeper look at his work, because my guess would be there's a limited number of ways to solve the problems presented by postmodernity. Mm-hmm. Right? And so the people who stand in front of that will end up with fairly similar solution sets, especially if we think of those solution sets as being multidimensional. Like some people are solving it at the level of their own emotions. Some people are solving it aesthetically. Some people are solving it academically, right? Mm-hmm. But especially if we broaden that out and go, okay, there's a number of different modes or moods in which the solutions can come up, we'll probably find that the solutions have a strong common element because you're solving for the same
that makes
problems.
Sense. Yeah. Then it gets down to semantics, though, because, and it sounds like you and I have a fairly similar understanding of what postmodernism means. So that's actually refreshing. But I've discovered in conversations, and not just conversations with like liminal folks, but conversations with people from all kinds of perspectives. When I just sort of like nonchalantly say, yeah, metamodernism, it's a thing that comes after and reacts to postmodernism. And I've assumed that they mean the same thing I mean by postmodernism. But there's a lot of people out there who postmodernism for them has been defined by the likes of Jordan Peterson to specifically be a sort of boogeyman version of, left-wing pluralism. Left-wing diversity, representation, social justice warrior stuff. And so then if they have Jordan Peterson's view of postmodernism, then they think they're going to like metamodernism. And if they are opposed to that point of view, then they don't want to have anything to do with it. And actually metamodernism doesn't have any specific response to that stuff, because that's not what postmodernism is in the sort of ongoing intellectual usage of the term. My point being, yes, things will converge if they're trying to solve the same problem, but just the fact that two different things saying they're trying to solve a problem that they label postmodernism.
The same people using the same term might not be trying to solve the same problems.
Yeah.
And this is in the developmental psychology community, Integral's sort of close in that, the notion of the pre-trans fallacy is significant here, right? Like if you're looking at postmodernism and going, oh, that's a huge problem, we've got to escape back to traditional or modern or to the other side. But because you all agree that there's a problem with postmodernism, you get this like inchoate conflation of people who think that they're on the other side of postmodern, and some of them they've gone through the things, found the problems and tried to solve them, and other people haven't even gone into it yet. They just saw
but
it.
At least in this example, I imagine all these different people mean the same thing by postmodernism. So there's a thing in the middle. Some are going to the right, some are going to the left, some are going up, some are going down, but they're reacting to the same cluster of stuff. But what if somebody says, I'm reacting to postmodernism, but to them, postmodernism means a certain kind of train.
Right. Yeah. They mean the left or something like that. And then you get in the same problem, like, well, what do we mean by the left? Or this whole, like, Peterson's actually pretty good in specifying what he thinks he means.
Yeah.
Some kind of cultural Marxism. Right. And you're like, well, that's not what I mean by it at all. I think, if anything, you're looking at a perverse version of a narrow slice of the phenomenon. I often think of him as a self-loathing postmodernist, right? Because very multiple truths, and a guy steeped in Jungian psychology and Nietzsche, and right, there's a lot of things that he has in common with the general postmodernity, but he doesn't like something about that or reacts against a particular part of it, like he has an allergy to that. And I think it distorts a lot of amazing things he has to say, because he sounds really smart on certain topics, and really dumb on other topics. And fair enough, we all do. But when people come into that and go, okay, if that's what you mean by postmodern, then your whole set of solutions and responses in any direction will be different than if somebody means something completely different by postmodern. Right.
So maybe this can lead to a thought that can wrap things up if you're ready to be done.
Yeah.
So I would just leave it as, back to the sort of map and territory thing, or signifier and signified thing. So if somebody is looking at territories on the map, or territories in reality, and they feel that there's some connection, that these territories border on each other, or are often just the same, much of them are the same thing, but named in different ways, or whatever. And then the term metamodernism has just sort of been applied to like the east side of the mountains by some people, and the west side of the mountains by another group of people. And then you're like, well, it's all one mountain, man. Sure, I'm all for that. But using this map and territory analogy, if you've got people if there's a country in Asia called Metamodernia or something, and there's a country in Africa called Metamoderny, and actually etymologically the terms come from completely different language families and blah, 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 it seems like a fool's errand to sort of try to make some sense geographically of these things. And I'm not going to cast judgment on, which of these is going on, but I would just warn people, don't get sort of like seduced by a word when you're looking for commonality or integrating different concepts.
Yeah, and that's, I think that warning is at the heart of why this is an important conversation to have. Especially in a world of constant rebranding and relabeling, right? If Facebook wants to call itself Meta, the community that uses that prefix a lot to indicate the type of thinking we're doing now has to make a decision, right? And Facebook could have rebranded itself as Metamodernism, right? Or right, that anybody could use these things in any way. And even if we think there's a lot of commonality between a lot of different versions, we need to have some kind of differentiation between those versions and some kind of general semantic boundary or vetting procedure. My guess would be it has to be multiple in the integral sense of the four quadrants. You think, well, there's a couple different complementary styles of vetting something, right? Individually, we need to be able to clarify what we mean a little bit more. But then also we need to get together with people who we think are actually a part of this and see what it feels like we have in common, because there may be elements to what is and isn't what we mean that we won't be able to articulate. That'll just be part of the way we are together. And then also there will be, there might be signs of how you live in the world that will be part of that. Or there might be some kind of, computational modeling that could be done. You're like, oh, of course, according to the computer, it's these people do this and they make these four algorithmic moves. You're like, okay. And so something these several different complementary forms of vetting, I think, will be needed ultimately in order to figure out what it is that we want to be talking about, that we sometimes reach for the word metamodern to describe. Anyway, fantastic conversation, Greg.
Yeah,
thank you very much. I love the balance of acceptance and challenge that you bring to this.
That's a compliment. Thank you.